Welcome to A Day with Dre podcast. I'm your host, Dre. As usual, I'm going to talk about things both heavy and light, sometimes controversial, sometimes silly, but just trust the process. If you're new to this, please make sure you like and subscribe. You can find me on YouTube, clips on Instagram Reels, TikTok. The podcast is hosted on Spotify, but available on all platforms. Any likes, any subscriptions, comments, any feedback really is integral. Those of you that have done that, it's greatly appreciated. And if you are new, please, again, leave a like, follow, subscribe, do whatever you feel like doing. So, of course, that's the business as usual. So please continue to make this thing grow and allow me to get my warranted or unwarranted opinions on things, and we'll go from there. All right. So it's Sunday, beginning of June. We've got Pride Month, and we'll talk about some things related to that on other episodes. But really what I wanted to talk about is we're a week removed from Memorial Weekend and 5 years removed from the Memorial Weekend of 2020. So if you remember Memorial Weekend of 2020, that's the weekend where the George Floyd situation happened. So again, those of you that have listened before, I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Grew up in that general neighborhood where George Floyd was killed. My mom, up until just a couple of days ago, still lived in that neighborhood. And if you remember 2020, you remember things were crazy, right? We had a presidential change. We had COVID going on. That was just a few months after the lockdown started. And of course, in Minneapolis, regulations are pretty tight. Memorial Weekend is typically a good weekend. It's the start of the summer officially for a lot of people. Weather's nice. There's a lot of barbecuing. Generally the vibes are feel good. But of course, in 2020, it was all different because people were, staying at home. The get-togethers were smaller. Summer just wasn't hitting the same. People were stuck at home. People were frustrated. People were sick. People were dying. And we thought we hit our rock bottom when everyone was watching a police officer kneel on a man's neck for 9 minutes or whatever as he's saying he can't breathe. He ends up dying. My city breaks out in very intense protests, which lead to some rioting, some martial law. Again, we're thinking this is the rock bottom. 5 years ago, last weekend, we're thinking it's rock bottom. There's no way society can stay like this. It's only going to get better. And we were wrong because that rock bottom kind of became the new normal, minus, of course, the mask mandates and whatnot. Of course, that ultimately went away. But what happened culturally, that was the beginning of a new normal in the States and honestly, probably worldwide, right? I don't know. You tell me if I'm wrong. It seems like the tensions that came from that summer, that event, have yet to change. If not, they might have gotten worse. Okay. So obviously with all of that anger and frustration that came about in that time, we have to think about why it was there. Did that change anything? And most importantly, what did we learn from that weekend? Some things that have been exposed from that weekend as the misinformation regarding the death of Floyd still run rampant to this day. People that we put in office that are supposed to help lead and bring us together spread misinformation about the death that continue to drive people apart. When in the United States, you're supposed to be one country, and those people continue to show that it's not one country. They want this country to be their country, and they want you to assimilate in the ways they want you to be. Otherwise, shut up and be out the way, which ultimately is inherently non-American. I mean, we literally started off of people making noise. Well, I should say America started off with that. Obviously, my people weren't a part of the Boston Tea Party and whatnot, but it was literally people complaining and making noise. But now complaining and making noise about things is, if you don't like it, you can leave. Just very funny how that works. As soon as the oppressed become the oppressors, they kind of turn into the people that they were fighting so hard to get away from. Whatever. That's neither here nor there. Anyways, why is this important now? We have a country that's just as divided as it's ever been, because people want it to be divided. And of course, we have, everyday people like you and me that are just pawns in this big game. But the powers that be know it's easier to control everything. It's easier to control people. It's easier to keep the machine going. And this isn't some anti-capitalism rant that I'm about to go on. But ultimately, if we don't come together and say, we can't afford anything. Why can't we do this? Why can't we afford that? Why can't we be financially free? If we're too busy fighting with each other about bathrooms and race and things like that, people should just inherently have the rights to do the things that they want to do as long as they're not harming others. But instead, we're fighting about that while people that control everything are continuing to pick our pockets. But again, we're too busy fighting each other, and the people that are winning the game of capitalism are keeping us down and keeping us apart. Why is social media all of a sudden making it so they aren't checking for misinformation anymore? They want us to argue. They want us to fight. Anyways, we got a country as divided as ever. Will we ever get past it? Probably not. But can we at least get it better? Also, what happened with the George Floyd weekend? A lot of conservative talking points were based around George Floyd was a career criminal. He's not a hero. The woke left wants you to make this man a hero. And although some people might make him a hero, in reality, he's not a hero. Okay. But the whole point is you don't have to be a hero for people to want you to have justice. You don't have to be some elevated person in society to deserve to have a fair process. He was getting arrested over an alleged fake like $10 or $20 bill, and he died. You don't have to be a great person to not deserve to die over a petty crime that may not even have been a crime. And then people go around that point because obviously it's hard to argue against that point. And they'll say, well, he died of fentanyl overdose. But clearly he was not. There was no signs of overdose until someone was kneeling on his neck. Obviously, fentanyl and any opioid, if you take too much of it, will give you respiratory depression and you won't be able to breathe. But if you're breathing normally and then all of a sudden someone puts their knee on your neck and then you can't breathe, it's probably not the fentanyl that killed you, right? I think that just goes without saying. In none of the autopsies is fentanyl listed as the cause of death. It was just listed as being in his system. People hear fentanyl and they go crazy. I deal with fentanyl in patients every time I do surgery. It's very commonly used in anesthesia. Fentanyl does not equal death. So people need to stop using that fear of that drug. And of course, on the street, it's right. You have a right to be afraid of it because it does kill people on the street. But fentanyl does not equal death. So that's the main point. It's not about making George Floyd a hero. He's just the face of a system that has chronically failed people simply because of what they look like. So it's not making him a hero. It's in the same way that Emmett Till was not a hero. He was an innocent boy that became the face that sparked the civil rights movement. That does not make him a hero. He unfortunately met his demise from a bunch of cowards and liars, but that doesn't mean Emmett Till was a hero because you don't have to be a hero to deserve basic human dignity. That's the point. People on both sides of the political aisle here in the States understand that there's barriers. Otherwise, why would Donald Trump be saying he's the president that does the most for Black people? Why are the Democrats trying so hard to get Black support? Both political parties understand that Black people are in a worse situation than pretty much all other people, but I guess compared to white people especially. And they get that. You know, your politicians, your presidential candidates will address that point. But for some reason, the people that support them a lot of the time don't support that point, or they'll talk about how Donald Trump talked about how he's done more for Black people than any president ever. Why would he say that if Black people were on the same ground as white people? Yet you'll get a lot of people that are his supporters that'll turn around and say that, you know, everything is equal and fair in 2025. Importantly, again, what came out of the summer of riots? What did we learn from that? It obviously took the mask off of a lot of things that were still happening and continue to happen in this country. But what was learned from, did we get better as a country? Obviously, you know how I feel about that. Things have stayed the same or if not have gotten worse, but what do you think? Because after that summer, there was many talks of reform in policing, of education, healthcare, areas where as a country, it was widely understood that Black people were behind the eight ball. They were getting worse outcomes across the board in every single category. And I have other podcasts that talk about a lot of those examples in detail. All right. But just for example, policing was the face of the issue. It quite literally was represented by George Floyd dying in 2020. So a lot of the talk was getting police reform, using less lethal force, having, you know, qualified immunity maybe not exist anymore. So as of today, June 1st, 2025, qualified immunity still exists. And if you're not sure what that means, it's a law that shields all government officials. They can't be personally liable in any civil lawsuit or any action taken basically in the scope of their job. So if you're a government official, if you're a police officer, it is hard to make you personally liable for anything. And where this becomes an issue is it's not always about police killing people, but police hurt people on accident all the time. And I'm not trying to go the all cops are bastards route here, but there are things that happen that are bad at the hands of police officers because they are a profession that works in dangerous situations. And for example, I cannot hurt someone with negligence and be fine. Okay, if I'm doing something and someone sues me, I can still be in trouble. I can be named in a civil suit. Police officers, they're chasing someone and not having any regard for the other people around, and they end up hurting other people in the crossfire. In a lot of places, they cannot be held liable for that. Or if they're arresting someone and using excessive force and, fuck up your car, break your nose, something like that, they're not personally liable for that. So it allows them to get away with a lot of stuff that other people cannot get away with. If a politician does something that ends up hurting you, again, qualified immunity, they're not personally liable for it. They won't be held in court. So there's a that of course can be argued that they're just doing their job and that basically gives them immunity, and it has to be proven that they're doing something outside the scope of their job. So that never was addressed. Politicians and law enforcement, et cetera, are held to a different set of rules than all other Americans. So qualified immunity, still the same. In 2024, law enforcement killed um, more Americans than in any number of recorded history. We try to make this a conservative versus liberal issue or Republican versus Democrat issue, but Joe Biden was still the president in 2024, and the highest amount of police killings happened in history. So obviously, like, a president doesn't control this. We try to make it seem like a president can control this, but this is way beyond just the president of the United States. Obviously, they can set a tone about some of these things. 25% of that were Black Americans. Obviously, Black Americans are not 25% of the population. So once again, it's showing that Black Americans are dying at a much higher rate. Black American men are 2.5 times higher to die in a police encounter than white men. So a lot of people will be like, look at the crime, look at the crime. But this is saying in an even situation, when white men and Black men are both encountering the police. So that's taken away the per capita crime rate for those of you that don't understand math. So if the same people are pulled over by police, one of those people are 2.5 times more likely to die. So you can get rid of your per capita of that. I'm sure those of you that want to rebuttal are sitting here thinking about, because this isn't a raw crime data issue. This is a per encounter issue. And ultimately what it comes from is that the legacy of policing is just because you're a cop doesn't mean you're a bad person, but it is inherently a bad field. So that does attract some bad people. Fields that, just like the field I'm in, just because you're a doctor or a surgeon doesn't mean that you have a God complex, but the field does attract people that have that. People that want to flex their power over people, people that want to just dominate people are attracted to law enforcement. I mean, enforcement's literally in the word. They like to enforce things. So not only that, but today's modern law enforcement, I mean, again, there's a whole episode on this, but it literally absorbed the old slave patrols that existed until the end of the Civil War, and they were made illegal with the 13th Amendment because the slave patrols obviously can't exist if slavery is illegal. And then the 14th Amendment, which came out in 1868, was supposed to grant equal protections to African Americans, because before that, there were the black codes that went into law immediately after saying black people can't do this, and it was enforced by the police. And then, of course, Jim Crow laws came. How do Jim Crow laws get passed when there's an amendment to say that African Americans are supposed to have certain protections? Again, because as people like to stand by the Constitution and say that Constitution states that everyone is protected, and then somehow conveniently forget that under the same Constitution, there were decades and decades of not equal and not good treatment, but somehow in 2025, it's supposed to all be perfect and dandy under that same Constitution. I digress. But of course, like those cultures that were built in those institutions, those police forces that enforce those racist laws, These are the same organizations that were enforcing all these laws, the sheriffs, the state troopers. That culture exists within an organization. Just because laws change doesn't mean the culture has changed. Yes, the laws change, and maybe it can't be so overtly obvious that there are systemic issues going on within these organizations, but they don't change. And for an example of this is the powers that be, the legal system, when they're investigating things from that summer, the Louisville Police Department and the Minneapolis Police Department for, history of many reports of using excessive force and negligent behavior that resulted in obviously George Floyd's death and Breonna Taylor's death and many others that maybe didn't die, hurt, didn't get their due process. Justice was not given to them. So there were investigations going on from the federal government for a pattern or practice of conduct in violation of the U.S. Constitution and federal law. So it was noted that these actual departments continuously violated people's constitutional rights and the federal law, and they were doing excessive force. They were doing unlawful searches, unlawful detainments, unlawful arrests, primarily against Black and Native American people. Those were the people that were getting mistreated the most. And then the Trump administration just said nothing to see here, even though it's documented that these police departments were mistreating people. That's on wax. That's documented. But the investigation wasn't over because they still have to figure out, why is this happening? Where did it start? And the Trump administration just said, you know what? Nothing to see here. Investigation over. That should be infuriating to everybody, not just the people that are wrongfully affected by that. Because if it can happen to them, if it can happen to us, eventually it can happen to you. But we don't think like that. We don't see the foreshadowing. We don't say, oh, if they're mistreating these people and getting away with it, maybe eventually it will come to us. We don't, for some reason, as a society, we don't think like that. So basically, after all that, after all the protests, after all the damage, after the lives lost, what got better? Nothing. Abso-fucking-lutely nothing. It just got worse. Actually, in a poll, more than half the U.S. adults say things are about the same as before Memorial Weekend 2020. A third say things are worse, and just a small, 10% of people think things are actually better. And that's just regarding policing and things like that. So of course, also what happened in that summer was all the corporate leaders were saying, wow, things are bad. There's all these racial inequalities. What can we do? When they started having African artist sections in Target and all that stuff. I don't want to say bullshit, because for the people that got put in those stores, I'm sure it helped them greatly, but they created more commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then Trump became president, and a lot of them were like, okay, we don't have to do this anymore, showing their true colors. A majority of Americans said that the only reason those companies did that is because they felt pressure from society to do it, but they actually didn't mean it. I think across the aisle, both people that are conservative and progressive both felt that the companies were just doing these things for lip service, but didn't actually mean it. Turned out they were right, because as soon as federal pressure to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion went away, the companies were like, all right, we're good, done with that. So again, the corporations, they're showing that honestly, as long as people keep buying things, they don't actually care what's happening to people individually. And that's not all companies. Some companies decided to stand by these things, but they were just looking at it as a box that they had to check and weren't actually invested in decreasing socioeconomic barriers in their country. What about in education? A study done between the University of Miami and Rutgers University showed that Black students are twice as likely as white students to be in very underfunded districts, which, if you think about how many more white people there are than Black people, that's actually pretty staggering. 3.5 times more likely to be in chronically underfunded. So not just districts that are currently underfunded, but districts that have been underfunded for many, many, many years. It's almost like people are placed in areas where they just don't have the opportunity to succeed, because education, regardless of if that leads to college or beyond college, you got to get your education from something. It's got to start somewhere. And also, Black college students are underrepresented. You already know that. In college enrollment, and completion rates and face much harder challenges in accessing financial aid. But if you let the conservative media tell you, a lot of people of color, primarily Black people, are taking college spots at a much higher rate. They're getting all these free rides, etc. But the data shows they're under enrolled. They have actual challenges in accessing financial aid. So the reality is not lining up with the talking points that are out there. And people get to say these things on TV and cause all this anger and divisiveness, and it's not even true. And we're not holding people accountable for lying on TV. So obviously, if we have this long historic examples of inequalities against people of color, i.e., talking about Black people in this situation, it's very clear. I mean, there were laws that permitted it. Systemic racism existed and it still exists, even if you choose not to believe in it, no matter how much data shows you that. And for people that don't really understand what that means, I like to use the training for the marathon example. And this really oversimplifies it, but for some people, it helps them start to understand the concept. So in no world is running a marathon easy. And there's like the saying, life is like a marathon, right? Doesn't matter what color you are, what background you have. Life is a marathon, and marathons are inherently difficult. But imagine if you train for a marathon, were, allowed to just go buy the proper training shoes, get on a good diet, get a good training regimen. And then this other group of people that also have to run this marathon aren't allowed to get aren't allowed to get proper shoes, aren't allowed to have the income to hire, a strength coach, or I guess for a marathon, you don't need a strength coach, but you get what I'm saying. They don't get trainers. They can't get a good meal plan. They actually don't even have shoes. Oh, and on top of that, for some reason, they're being forced to wear a weighted vest. So it's not saying the person that gets all the resources is easy, but if you're comparing it to the people that aren't allowed to have the resources and actually given more barriers, well, then life is, in comparison, a lot easier. And the people that have all those barriers, the only reason they have them is because for some reason, the society around them is saying that they can't wear shoes. They have to wear this weighted vest. But the other people it's hard enough to just do a regular marathon. So they get to have all the other resources. And that's a very rudimentary, elementary way of looking at it. But that's effectively what the situation is. Saying Black people deal with systemic racism is not saying that white people's life is easy. It's saying it's not because of what you look like that you have your barriers. Or for a lot of Black people, it's simply just because of what they look like, their life automatically gets harder for no other reason. And there's so much evidence that points to that if you still deny that, then you're just delusional. You're not living in reality. So where do we go from here? We still have people that don't even believe that there are issues due to different races. So where do we go? American culture in general feels like there's this shift towards ethnocentrism, old school American values, old school conservative values, because life is getting a little worse for everyone. The people that are supposed to be bringing us together instead say life is getting worse because of these people. So it makes people point the fingers at each other. And of course, when you have a diverse country, but there is one majority population pointing the fingers at everyone else, they have the power to make those smaller populations of people life a little harder, if that means that they can think that will make their lives better. And it's obviously way beyond just white and Black, right? I use the Black example a lot because that's like the original American sin. That's the one that people can see most clearly, but it's not just things happening to Black people. It's foreign exchange students. I guess technically they're not American, but they are here legally. They're saying out loud that they want to get rid of habeas corpus. They're saying out loud that, martial law can be considered. For what? What is even going on right now that would even have to exist? What is going on right now that you would need to get rid of people's rights to protest? Like, are there dangerous protests happening all around? You get some students that say free Palestine and they're saying we should be able to just arrest all of them when they're not hurting anyone. They make some people late to work, but it's not like schools are getting burned down and destroyed. Our government is literally telling us that they want to suspend the rights of every person if it is against things that they want to do. It's not about keeping people safe. It's not about it's about law and order. They don't want anything going against what they have to say, to the point where they're revoking visas. They're, they're deporting people, and law and order is above freedom and inclusivity. It's right in front of us. This isn't me going on some paranoid rant. You can literally see it. It's right in front of us. But with that being said, censorship and law and order are taking over. Enforcement agencies aren't going to be held accountable as long as they're doing the will of their government. And the places that we so strongly like to condemn and say that these are bad countries, we're taking the blueprint and turning into them. I mean, could you imagine medicine without malpractice? If people could do whatever they wanted and there was no regard for the outcomes of people, that's effectively what our government's is planning on doing. They want people to enforce their will with no accountability. So, I mean, the authoritarian state is here, or it's at least they're ramping it up, seeing how far we can go with it. And if there was one country full of people that are supposed to be against that, it's supposed to be the United States of America. But instead, we're fighting with each other about bathrooms, fighting with each other about teaching proper history, and just a bunch of stupid stuff like that. I mean, they're even using social media. Could you imagine people using your social media? Half the time when I used to post on social media regular, it was just trolling and joking. But now you can't even, if you have a troll past or a joking past, they might use your social media to prevent you from being able to travel into the country. Imagine if you, classic American person here, thinking America is great, Europe is too socialist, Europe is too this, Europe is too that, and then you want to go on a vacation, let's say you want to go to Italy, and they see you talking crap about Europe 6 or 7 years ago, and they say, actually, sorry, you can't come here. You'd be like, what the hell? Because of a tweet? And that's effectively what we're starting to do against other people. Sometimes it's not even about our country. People can say something bad about another country that we are allies with, and we'll say they can't come here. And that country might be doing something terrible against people of their ethnic background. It doesn't matter. We can prevent your entry into our country. And we're picking and choosing on who to do these things to. And then as we keep getting away with it, that target group will get bigger and bigger. Again, the authoritarian state is growing. So again, I ask you, in 5 years since Memorial Weekend of 2020, what has gotten better? What have we come closer as people? What are we doing? What are we doing to come together? And some people were willing to sacrifice a lot of social liberties for more money in their pocket. Has society returned to the pre-pandemic times that we blamed on a president instead of just realizing that the world has changed forever? Probably not, but that's where we are. The disappointing thing about it is it's this poison, this division is that people died to make better is getting worse, and it's ruining all phases of life. I mean, we can't even watch the WNBA. Caitlin Clark is arguably the most influential college player, and obviously she's got that rivalry with Angel Reese, and every time they play, it turns into internet race war just because two different colored basketball players might not like each other, and it turns into a race war. Like we can't do anything anymore. Everything is so divided, everything. But that's just something to ponder. The signs are there, they're overt. Our country it's not getting any better, and the powers that be aren't here to help us. So what can we do as the people? How do we come together? How do we stop the division? How do we stop hating each other so much? And that's more of a question to sit and ponder. And I wish I had some happier things to talk about, but naturally with the 5 years since George Floyd, I wanted to reflect on a lot of the issues that made that situation so important. And unfortunately, I don't have a lot of happy stuff. But it is June 1st. It's Pride Month. For those of you that identify as someone that makes this their month, I hope you have a great month. We'll have a couple episodes coming out in June. And again, if you're new to this, please comment, like, subscribe to A Day with Dre podcast, available anywhere you get your podcasts, and help me continue to grow this thing. And I'm looking forward to hearing y'all's feedback. All right, take care.